I'm just going to talk about 4 points. Make them, they're very vital, and hopefully during the later discussions I'll elaborate them. First, we mustn't use the term inflation loosely. Prices, according to the official economic theory, go up because there's too much demand and not enough supply. Prices will go up if there's too much demand, but you cannot turn logical statements around and still have them valid. If a man holds a loaded pistol to his head and pulls the trigger, he falls dead. On the other hand, if a man falls dead, you cannot assume that he put a trigger. There are 1,000 other ways that one can die and fall to the floor. That is extremely important, because nobody is idiot enough when he moves from a town of 20,000 to New York City to expect the price level to stay the same. Then how in the name of the good Lord, when humanity is making such a move and nobody can count on fingers and toes the number of 5 million-headed cities on any of the continents with the exception of Antarctica and of course Greenland. So we must distinguish between legitimate inflation and structural price increase. In 1970, I came to that conclusion, and I wrote a 70-page manuscript and sent it blind to 70 world publishers on economic matters, and one bought it and published it, the leading French publication, La Revue Économique. There's a reason for it. 13 years earlier, I later discovered, a couple of economists, one of them was Pierre Viacab, pointed out that there is an unknown factor that we haven't discovered that explains why prices have arisen. And I touched upon the unknown factor. An offer from the book publisher, Levy Cullman, produced the book, but within that year, the official recognition, it wasn't possible. Now, that's the first point. The second point to be made is the following. During the Depression, there was a lack of purchasing power. And Roosevelt, when he was inaugurated in his first term, one of the first things he did was declare a moratorium on all the banks. 9,000 had already closed their doors. And he renewed the moratorium, and he listened to everybody with an idea. And when he introduced his legislation, the vital point was that the banks must not acquire an interest in the other financial pillars, namely moratorium, mortgages. There wouldn't have been the subprime mortgage if that had not been repealed to a couple of decades later. Insurance companies, and the other one was all this was investment banking. Stock brokerages. In short, investments. The central bank was not to finance investment capital. That legislation was repealed beginning in the 1970s as the banks had recovered. Without that, the amount of excess credit that our friend proclaimed is true. But this is the big factor, because what the banks do is they acquire interest in the other financial factor and use that as monetary base to apply the monetary credit. And that 10 to 1, I stopped following that in Canada because I needed a denominator. And otherwise it'd be infinity. And I had reached 400 to 1. The American figure was 330 to 1. And it's gone up much since with derivatives and all the rest. They used the cash or near cash reserves of the other pillars as monetary base, and they got into trouble once every 7 years. I don't know whether they were appealing to the Lord to have chosen 7, and the government, your government, our government, Canadian government, bailed them out, and in a secret or semi-secret way, which made them accomplices, so that the bank's political powers increased just through their having been bailed out. And that is when social services were cut, etc., etc. They coincided, and the central government, yours and ours, downloaded it to the states, our provinces, and the states to the municipalities, and our roads are shamefully potholed, where the blown up communication companies like Northam have cut into the roads, putting in useless fiberglass conduits. In short, the Rooseveltian in any sort of monetary reform. Getting back, the point to be made is this: there could have been no subprime mortgage crisis if they had stuck to what Roosevelt, who wasn't an economist but a very honest, caring man, introduced on the advice of economists. So in the picture that my predecessors painted, stay with what you said, but add these things to it, and many more. Now, I don't want to take much of my time, more than my time, but I do want to say this. I sat through a very, very interesting session just previous to this one on fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is not only religious fundamentalism. A philologist who died in 1913 by the name of de Saussure pointed out that language has its claws and affects how we do our thinking. He died in 1913. He published this shortly after Einstein developed his theory of relativity. You see the relationship. That was another idea of science that creeps. So we have to consider language, and we have to take account of how language is affecting our thinking. Technology affects our language. Karl Marx, for whom I have a great regard with a lot of reservations, was a son of the railway age. Can you see this? He starts with primitive communism, although it wasn't quite that simple, went on to more or less feudalism, went on to industrial capitalism, we could add finance capitalism, until the train tracks. It was the railway building age, reached the great terminal of socialism. Now, we are under the influence of the atomic technological age. And if you wonder why you have this expansion, derivatives are not just a multiplication. You know, if the Virgin Mary had bought an insurance company of $1,000 or whatever the unit was at the time for the infant Jesus, there would not be compound interest. There would not be enough silver to pay that. But derivatives don't do that. That's the exponential curve. The exponential curve, as anybody with a knowledge of elementary calculus will tell you, is 1 plus x over 1 plus x squared over 2 multiplied by 1. So with the rate of growth, 1 doesn't grow, cross it out. X grows in relation to x, 1 replaces that term, and the second derivative and the third and the fourth to infinity, and then there is Hiroshima. And that is, I was at Cambridge University for a this was about 3-4 years ago, at a conference on modern economics. And at one of the plenary sessions, I was in the audience, 3 experts on derivatives were talking about derivatives. And they didn't particularly like them. But from the floor I said, should derivatives be controlled? They evaded the question and embarrassed. From one of them I had learned a great deal about derivatives several years earlier. Finally I said, I didn't ask you, will they be controlled? I asked, should they be controlled? Tremendous embarrassment, no answer. Those guys were not allowed to, and they knew it. One was an employee of the United Nations. And it's those derivatives that have caused the present banking crisis. That's enough for an introduction. But please clean up the concept of inflation. Otherwise, you're giving half the punch, 9/10 of the punch. Get the banks, they're being bailed out. Even now, the Bank of England, by the way, is bailing out the Bank of England, the banks in trouble, by accepting subprime assets for government money, which is cash, and not letting the public know for until next October, I think, so that the public will not be disturbed.
Thank you very much.
There can be no democracy without information.
Without?
Information. Otherwise, it becomes a farce.
We have our last speaker, and due to technical difficulties, we're getting short of time, so we need to move right on to our last speaker. Her name is Geraldine Perry. She's a librarian, a researcher. In a recent year, she's turned to natural health and become a small farm advocate. And she's author of a recent book called The Two Faces of Money. Geraldine?
Okay, so standard. All right. There was a reason I called my book Two Faces of Money, and I think at least some of us have discussed that. Maybe most of us know it, intuitively. Money is something we love to hate and hate to love. So I want to share with you a quote. I'm going to try to sum up and maybe highlight some of the things that we've heard today. The first one, I think, let me see, it's going to be from Charles Lindbergh, who wrote a really good book called Banking, Currency, and the Money Trust that was published in 1913 before the Federal Reserve Act was passed. So, and he was talking about a certain kind of money that was then in effect and was in effect actually in whole or in part since our country was created, despite the Constitution telling us to do otherwise. And here's what he says. In many respects, money is the strangest of all human creations. On the one hand, it has civilized the world, and on the other hand, it has commercialized and in a manner criminalized the people. But that is not because the purpose of money is erroneous. It's because the office of true money has been usurped by false money, which has served as a false god. And the worship of this false money has caused the degradation of the soul of humanity. None of the dramatic stages through which humanity has passed has been as intense and complicated as that through which it is now passing. This was in 1913. This next sentence really hits home. That is because a false system has been established, and the longer humanity attempts to struggle forward under this false money system, the more severe the struggle will become. Lincoln had some other points to make that I want to share with you, just a couple of them. These are from an abstract of Lincoln's monetary policy that is certified by the Legislative Reference Service of the Library of Congress, entered into Congressional Report for the 76th Congress. I think it was in 1935 or something. But I'll also give you an idea kind of what money is. Let me back up a second by saying money is defined as a medium of exchange. Nothing more, nothing less. Money systems are bookkeeping systems, accounting systems. Whether you have the current one or you create the government, a public credit, what I talk about, or the social credit. Okay, so here's a couple things that Lincoln had to say. Tell us about money. First of all, money is a creature of law, and the creation of the original issue of money should be maintained as the exclusive monopoly of national government. Another one, capital has its proper place and is entitled to every protection. But the wages of men should be recognized in the structure of and in the social order as more important than the wages of money. What is the wages of money? It's the interest that's created when the money is not created, and that expands exponentially in the out years. So in the beginning, you don't really notice it, but in the out years, like we've seen with these charts, it starts, and then the derivatives just, are carrying it right out the window, and they're looking for more and more ways to support that system, and a militarized police state is what they have to do, because you've got people in Somalia, Chevron oil, and in Mexico complaining about or protesting about the way that these corporations are going in and destroying the local resources and the ability of the people to produce for themselves. And then you've got, when they create some kind of a ruckus, they go and protest, the corporations form a partnership with the government. And this is nothing new. It's been going on forever. We had that same thing going on in the 1880s during the Gilded Age when, people would die, all the time. 6,000 and 7,000 people would die, these worker strikes, and then you'd pull out the militia, the National Guard, and the private hired guns. So the story is really the same. It's just what's happening right now because of a media, the kind of media system that we've got, is it's going under the radar. Most people aren't aware of what's happening in Cochabamba or Somalia or Oaxaca, Mexico, and all of these places where the indigenous, or India. India is a good one because the farmers there, because of the way the system is tilted, they're taking out these loans, they're to buy these patented seeds that never regenerated, or the toxic chemicals, and then they're drinking the chemicals because they can't pay their debts. That's what happened in the United States. Many times that's why the farmers would protest. Okay, a couple more from Lincoln, just to give you an idea of what government, constitutional money would do. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, according to the Constitution, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity, like Richard was telling us. Money, if we install a debt-free, what I call debt-free, democratic, you want to call it democratic, you could call it democratic, once you install that, money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity, because you've got all of that exponentially exploding interest taking out of the equation, and then you balance the system according. It doesn't have to have the money, your money supply growing all the time, because you're taking that demand that interest is putting on the money creation process. So you take that out, and the money is created in balance to the goods and services that exist in the economy, the real economy. That's what the real economy is called. I threw away my my original talk, by the way. Okay, we need a revolution. Some of the people at the conference already have been talking about a revolution, and I, as a Kucinich supporter, I talked about revolution when I found him, and I said, wait a minute, something's wrong here. I really think, though, we need a peaceful revolution, and one that returns to the original principles and ideas of the founding documents. And by the founding documents, I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Because as I write in my book, I'm talking about a second constitution and a sovereign power structure that surrounds the Federal Reserve that was created after that. The Reconstruction Amendments created this second constitution, and there's a lot of historical information that supports that idea. And also the reason why we went to the into the Civil War was not, and even Lincoln would tell you, was not about slavery. It was, if anything, in Lincoln's mind, it would have been about wage slavery, as much as about slavery itself. He wanted to save the Union because he knew that the money powers were trying to split the country in two and rake up that way they could have a better chance of raking up the profits from doing that. So a revolution we need, but I think we need to take it to the most basic level, understand what the Constitution tells us. You hear a lot of things about gold is supposed to be money and all of that. All you have to do is go back and read the Constitution itself to find that out. Congress has the power to coin. That means create or make. Look it up in the dictionary. To coin money, regulate the value thereof, and a foreign coin, and fix the standards of weights and measures. Congress did fix the standards of weights and measures with the Coinage Act of 1792, which was then mutilated by the money powers in 1873, was called the Crime of 73. I talk about it in my book. But what they also did was define a dollar in terms of decimal units. It was the first time it was done in the history of the world. And they said, because there was a foreign coin, the Spanish coins and all of this, that the values would float back and forth. So they defined a standard unit of coins for gold, metal, and silver that regular people, you and me, could go out and mine and then have minted and spend into circulation debt-free, just like a farmer could go over and grow hemp or tobacco and use that to pay his taxes. It was a form of money when they were using it to pay taxes. How do we do this revolution? First of all, we used to say with Dennis Kucinich, we're the ones we're waiting for. And every one of us in this room and everyone you talk to has to understand you're the one that needs to do things. You're the one that the world has been waiting for. Not some leader someplace else. It's you who have to go and talk to your neighbor, your friends, whether they want to listen or not. People with different ideological backgrounds, you have to share ideas. It's hard, I know, because I've tried. I've worked really hard at this. I could give you, let me just tell you, Lindbergh talked about this. I was going to talk about a little bit about the left-right divide, which is basically pretty fake. And in my book, one of the underlying themes I have is there is no new thing under the sun, because for the third part, I go into a brief history of money from Babylonia forward. I call it the man-made god of ancient Babylonia. But the political partisanship has been really one of the biggest and most pervasive methods of dividing and conquering. So this is what Charles Lindbergh wrote about it in 1913. Partisanship has been the cause of retarding all social progress. The money interests have done everything that's been possible for them to do in order to divide the people of this country into factions commonly known as political parties, because it was directly in their interest to do so. They're doing the same thing today. The money interests can deal with the political bosses much more satisfactorily than they could with half or more of the people's representatives. Party government is factional government and not national government. Anyone who claims that political parties are required in order that someone should be made responsible for government is either ignorant or dishonest. Several decades later, in 1982, I believe this next book was published, Anthony Sutton, who was a fellow at the Hoover Institute associated with Stanford University, wrote in a book called America's Secret Establishments. More effective than outright censorship is the use of the left-right political spectrum to neutralize unwelcome facts and ideas or just condition citizens to think along certain lines. Any discussion between left and right is never allowed to develop into a discussion along the lines of Jeffersonian democracy. The best government is the least government. And I was going to talk about a little bit about a quote from a book called Alternatives to Economic Globalization. And they're talking about the need for returning to power sharing, self-organizing, and minimizing the need for a coercive central authority. That's exactly what the founding documents were designed to do, was to put a people, a sovereign, give people sovereignty, not the president, not a king somewhere, but the people. So it was localized government. The government was supposed to come from the bottom up. Okay, so back to the Jeffersonian democracy, the best government is the least government. The discussion and the funding in the left-right debate is always toward more state power, use of state power, and away from individual rights. And that's what's happening now, and it's going to be happening we're going to just see this whooshing sound towards more militarism, and it's in the United States, obviously. By and large, control of information has been successful. The intellectual world is still locked in a phony verbal battle between left and right, whereas the real struggle is the battle between individual freedom and the encroaching power of the absolute state. The conflict between the two controlled groups keeps an apparent informational conflict alive. Unwelcome facts that fall into neither camp can be effectively neutralized because they will incur the wrath of both right and left. In brief, any publication which points up the fallacy of the left-right dichotomy is ignored, and citizens keep trooping to the polling booth in the belief they have a choice. 1982, he wrote this. Noam Chomsky, lots of other people have said the same thing. I'm going to finish really quickly with what Robert Owen, who was the co-sponsor to the original Federal Reserve Act, 1913. It was also known as the Glass Act. He talked later about it, almost immediately afterward, because he was saying what happened was shenanigans. Again, political shenanigans. They changed some verbiage. Owen was a banker also. He wanted inserted into that original bill a provision that would give the dollar debt-paying power. And what they did was change that around so that the dollar had a debt-creating power. In other words, interest was attached onto that. So here is what he said in a book that was published. He became part of a monetary reform group in the 30s. And he wrote in a foreword to a book by a lady named Gertrude Coogan. 1935, this book was published, middle of the Depression. And here's what he said. The solution of the problem to protect our homes does not rest with a few leaders in a distant city. It's necessary for every man and woman to appoint himself and herself a leader. Honest money groups must be formed in every block, every precinct throughout the United States, and in every rural community. It's hopeless to think that a few public-spirited citizens in some of the key cities of the United States can accomplish this enormous benefit. They cannot. Their handicaps are many. The truths themselves are very simple, but many of the newspapers and publishing companies allow themselves to be used to carry misinformation to the American public while neglecting to print the truths. This was in 1935. Talk about control of information. Honest money principles are understandable to everyone when the money subject is presented in its true light. America will remain in a deplorable condition only so long as the let George do it attitude continues. Americans must bestir themselves to eliminate the causes of this business depression and social disorder and restore prosperity and opportunities to the American people. Loyal Americans realize that the possession of knowledge carries with it the responsibility of dissemination, and I'm hoping that that's what all of us in this room do, and lots of people across the United States that are working on this problem right now. Thank you.
There are it's 5 to 4. Any of you that need to go to another
I do.
session that begins at 4 o'clock, you may feel free to, but otherwise, anyone that wants to stay can ask questions and so on. You need to, if you want to stay. Or
I can't. I've got another
okay.
talk. One world economic police state order. In case anybody's interested.
We have to.
Everything you're saying, he's actually
Uh, you have-
Hi.
okay, he's talked to Katrina.
First of all, I think that something should come out of every workshop. And, sorry. Something should come out of every workshop. And I thought maybe that this workshop could call for a debt moratorium for across the United States for all working people. And that's one thing that possibly could come out. Other things could come out based on the housing crisis, returning people to their homes, and not allowing evictions, an end to all evictions, and so forth. My question, which is unfortunate that it's going to the people who I wasn't really addressing it to, has to do with Karl Marx and there's a reason why Karl Marx called his book Capital a critique of political economy, in which he saw capital not as a thing, as somewhat as being described here as a thing, but as a social relationship. And it's from that relationship, as he developed, that leads to some of the discussion that was here, the gap and other things, as it was the idea that workers are not paid the full value, and he makes the difference between value and price. They're not paid the full value of what we produce. And as a result, there's always going to be that gap as long as we live in that type of a system with that type of a social relationship where people are not paid on a world scale the full value of what we as a class produce. So I guess I wanted to get to some of the stuff, starting with what Bob said, and just ask a lot of this. You said you were diverting from Marx after you used the M prime example, and it didn't seem that you were really diverting. It was he had a whole presentation of what value was based upon, which was based on the abstract social labor, the socially necessary labor that goes into the production of things and production of everything. And and people were not taking that into consideration. Also on these panels, even though I think there's a world of worthwhile stuff being put out here, there really needs to be a Marxist on the panel, I think, as well, on every single time we do this, to help get that discussion going between these different aspects and the different fields. So and maybe people would like to comment on it, especially Bob.
I would just say we must separate price from value. We don't want those two things together.
Exactly.
Price is what things cost. Value is the benefit you get from using something. They've confounded that because the capitalists use our need to raise the price.
I kind of liked, Richard, your chart up there. I can tie that in right quick with quite a lot of what I think Jerry said, and certainly to what I said. Could I do that? Just take a moment. It's be pretty interesting.
Please.
Okay. Remember I said all of the non-tangible values in banking, and they disappear? Okay? Right here. The non-tangible values of banking disappear. They go down here because there's a little bit of excess labor and stuff in there. So you got to go down into the labor also. Okay? And then, well, I'll summarize what my book said. That roughly 50% of our economy is waste. Then I said each one of these sectors of the economy has these unearned values. Okay? Unearned values. Unearned values is over 50% of our finance capital. Is unearned values that is reducing the efficiency of the economy. So, remember what I showed you, the stock market, 85% just disappears. So here, a lot of those values disappear, and that 85% of the stock market disappears, and that also cuts down in here somewhere into this labor also. So when we're done, as I lay it all out, here we are at about somewhere in the 50% mark. That's what I use in the book, and it's actually lower than that. Is when you have an efficient economy, and now we're going to tie it into Marx. You wanted to tie it into Marx. Okay? Now everything is equal pay, for equally productive labor, and all this ethereal world of high finance is gone. It's just like Marx said. Your pay is going to equal your share of the production, and all this waste is gone. And here you are right here, 50% or below in the economy you've got today. You are working, I put in the book, between 2 and 3 days a week, and it's less than that. But I'm in enough trouble when I say that, okay? And there's where it is. Oh, there. So there's a lot of comparison between what we are all saying, just like you said there was.
Yeah. Thank you. You had a question? Identify yourself, John.
I'm John Dennison, and my question for the panel is it possible to set up a parallel economic system to operate separately from the existing markets that could either cross national borders or work within for communities within a national border? And if so, how would you go about setting that up so that if the inevitable collapse that you're talking about does happen, then something already in place that's ready to start running, so that you don't have to just wait and try to pick up the pieces later?
You can't.
Well, I think Rick was going to
answer.
Yeah, just quickly. During the Depression, there were over 300 communities that had set up their own currencies. And there are communities that are doing that today. Now, you can only go so far with it because you can't create a local currency or a local barter system or a local labor trading system and buy a Ferrari with it, because but you can do certain things, and I think a lot of communities are doing that, including certain rural communities, and there's a whole movement to do that I think you've got to do in some instances when the overall economy is failing. But it's not a replacement for a major economic reform, but on a national level. But if I could just add one thing about the previous question by the gentleman who left here. If there's somebody who really wants to organize something, I wrote an article for the Economy in Crisis website a few months ago advocating the creation of a national debtors union to advocate for monetary reform, for all of the kinds of reforms that are needed just in the simple system of usury in the debt system, credit card rates, for example. And just think about it. I mean, how many people are in debt in the United States? 200 million? If you got 10 million people to join a national debtors union to pay $10 a year in dues, you would have an enormous, powerful lobbying organization that could make changes and could make inroads into the political system. I think I'm not an organizer, I'm a writer, but if somebody really wanted to know what to do to make a difference, form a national debtors union, set up an office to lobby the political system for these kind of changes.
Okay, well, William Cram was going to respond to this before, and John wanted to...
Let me complete what I hadn't time for. Until the year 1996, your federal government, when it built a bridge, a building, would carefully put on the debit side of its balance sheet the cost that it paid. But it would write off the asset value, called cash accountancy, in 1 year, so that you had on balance a debt that was not necessarily there. In 1995, that just about brought down the currencies of the world, because it was the beginning of NAFTA, and Mexico had gone bust, its currency down, and that threatened to spread internationally. So Clinton's finance minister introduced finally double entry bookkeeping, accrual accountancy instead of cash accountancy, which I've just described. And by the time the accountants took that back to 1959, discovered $1.25 trillion. So that brought down interest rates and gave Clinton a second turn, produced the high-tech boom that bust around 2000. But that still left and still leaves unattended to the fact that the education, where the United States is starting to lag behind China, etc., is not considered a capital asset, nor is health care. Now, it was an American economist on the staff of the University of Chicago who earlier, at the end of World War II, was one of the hundreds of young American economists that Washington sent to Japan and Germany to study the damage and predict how long it would take before those two highly formidable competitors would compete again. And 20 years later, Theodore Schultz was awarded the so-called Nobel Prize for Economics for his conclusion. It is astounding how wide of the mark we were, including himself, because we concentrated on the physical destruction and ignored the fact that the highly disciplined, highly educated workforce in both those countries were intact. Now, we still don't, neither you in the States nor we in Canada, recognize the immense investment in human capital that is still being made, which has dropped relatively from what it should. We're not keeping up with China. So all these other heroic ventures, there's a place for them, but let's first of all introduce double entry bookkeeping, which was brought to Europe by the Crusaders, believe it or not, the Templars, or at least so the legend goes. Let's introduce it, keep up with the Templars and the Muslims of the time, and introduce accrual accountancy for, well, you have it for physical capital now because of the crisis. We got it in 2003 because you people got it, so it was not revolutionary to introduce. Neither country has the recognizes human capital when it is invested, and that is the most crucial thing. So there are things, obviously, that's crookery.
Well, and one manifestation of this is that we load our students with debt.
Oh, yes, which is good for business.
Okay, John just wanted to follow up, then Ralph, and then Houston.
I understand the difficulty of having individual communities with regard to trading with the outside communities. We had this problem in a lot of mining towns here with the script that used to be issued up until maybe the 50s or 60s. But some of the programs coming up later are going to be dealing with the Earth Federation and the World Parliament. Is it possible to begin to set up an economic system that works within the Federation now, regardless of waiting for governments to get in line or the rest of the system to collapse, to set up our own economic system that is already in place and is already structured and is already running, so that when everything else crumbles, there is a basis for the world to start over and continue on. Because then if we have something that we can point to people and say, this is working, then they can point to that and they can say, yes, we have a reason to buy into the Federation. We have a reason to buy into this new system. But if you don't provide something that they can grab hold of in these times of crisis, they're not going to look at you. They're not even going to listen to you. So until we can, if there is some means of setting up or starting to lay the foundation of this system now, perhaps it would behoove us to at least consider how we would do that, rather than continuing to beat our heads against the wall trying to talk about this system that's going to come crumbling down of its own weight.
I just want to say, come to the Civilian Earth Federation panel. They will be talking about that. Yeah.
I'll be quick. As a white friend once said to me, you spend too much time with white people, you become strange. So I spend too much time with capitalists because as I listened to this panel, I said, gee, if I could get a recording of this, I would sell it to all of the students in studying economy, because these are the most exciting classes on economy they will have. I will become a millionaire. That's just a joke. But 3 questions sort of the people have gone. Who will build the cat? Is one of our speakers. 3 more questions to go together. Why no more schemes, Ponzi schemes, as you're talking about the mortgage thing? What about the bottom feeders they're talking about? And don't the bottom feeders, if they are successful, why would that not gather more power, more money to those who already have it by taking the ends or the bottom of the mortgage crisis? Am I being clear? Well, why shouldn't they, when they buy them up, then they will accrue greater wealth? Because if the economy doesn't fold totally, then these people will, again, control a larger amount of the economy. And finally, we have so much reference in here to this grand document. And I say, how did this document come about? And we have to consider all these things. Thank you.
Someone want to respond? Well, I can't answer all your questions, but I will say one thing that's very, very important for anyone who's thinking about these issues to remember. Wealth is only produced by work. Wealth is only produced by the application of energy to resources. You can pile debt upon debt, promissory note on promissory note. It all comes back sooner or later to somebody doing the work of transforming the resources of the earth, the sun, the sky, the water into a usable service. The only way it'll stop is the person who the financial system is preying upon or is a parasite upon, taking their wealth that they're creating through work and saying, that's enough. I'm not going to do it anymore. That's what will stop it. They'll take everything from you until you've got nothing left. Then they'll look to take it from someone else. So where it stops, where the buck stops, is with the man or the woman who does the work. And that's each and every one of us.
Okay, then you can.
I gave you the bell. You bell the cat. You bell the cat. You bell the cat.
And I'll bell the cat.
Hi, and my name is Joe Fay. This question is really for Richard. It seems to me you've given us the tool for starting the revolution, and that's to create our own banks. Is that impossible for us to do? I mean, we have a bunch of predator banks out there right now, and the tool they're using against us is money, or the weapon they're using against us is money. Shouldn't we turn this back on them? Yes. Is it impossible for us to create a bank?
Well, one of the speakers said this morning, and I was talking to somebody, how many people control the financial system? We just had a book come out by this Rothkopf guy who says there's 6,000 people who rule the world. Well, one person I talked to, I was on a radio show the other night. I don't know if you know Jeff Rentz. Yeah. We were discussing this. I was on his show, and we discussed it. And Jeff said, no, I think there's 300. And I said, well, okay, so there's 300 of them and there's 6 billion of us. So What's the next step?
What is involved in setting up a bank?
I think, again, that it needs organization, and that's why I suggested a National Debtors Union. A National Debtors Union of 10 million members who pay $10 a year in dues, creating a $100 million a year budget. I mean, I worked for a Treasury agency. They got a lot of work done on a $200 million a year budget. A $100 million a year budget, what you could put in place for that could change the world. It takes organization, but it can be done, and it's not that many people.
This makes a lot more sense than starting a militia.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Want me to, you probably would say the same thing too. The Earth Federation has a provision for the creation of a bank, in effect, a funding administration. And if you want to know more about it, that's the panel you want to hear tomorrow.
What
It's 4 o'clock Saturday.
Yeah, tomorrow.
does that work within the conventional banking system, or is it an adjunct?
No, we're talking about a democratic Earth Federation in service of the people of the Earth, which, when the people unite and form the first stage of this federation, it will be a government. It will be a government for all the people of Earth. And like any government, it has the power of credit, and it has the power to create money. And already there are provisions, both in the Earth Constitution and in provisional world legislation, that are directly talking about what these people on this panel have been talking about, the fundamental transformation of the money system to one in the service of the people of Earth and not in the service of those 300 or 6,000 that now rule the Earth.
May I ask one more question?
Yeah.
The CFR, within the last couple of years, have floated the idea of the North American Union and even the Amero. I mean, there's already a foot for monetary reform.
Yeah, if you want to call it that.
Well, reform in terms of getting rid of dollars. How are they anticipating a real monetary reform? Are they co-opting the concept? Are they going to try to deep six it?
It's just rolling over into another debt system.
They're part of the system. Enough to be a curse.
Oh, absolutely.
For Canada, certainly for Mexico.
It's just another name for the
It's
same.
done the Americans a hell of a lot of good.
The North American Union is I think it's farther advanced than most people recognize.
Oh, absolutely.
There have been summits by the three leaders, and
At least 3 of
a
them
lot
that I'm
going
aware
on
of.
down around behind the scenes. Yeah.
Well, there's the NAFTA highway, right?
Yeah.
That's the 6-lane super
Yeah.
highway that's supposed to go from some port in Mexico all the way up to Toronto, I believe.
Yeah.
It's just collapsing currencies into an easier, manageable unit. That's all it is.
But is it going to make it more difficult for, say, the debtors union to be achieved?
Yeah.
I mean,
Makes it more controllable.
right. So what we're looking at is a timeline that is rapidly shrinking for effective action.
There's a tremendous crisis. I've been telling people that they're holding off until the November election. They don't want to tip the apple cart too much. Who knows? Ron Paul might get some votes. They're trying to keep it from collapsing until November. And what's going to happen in November is anybody's guess.
Nothing good.
Well, that's a positive note on which to end our discussion. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think we've had a very good